this part now we're going to go through the nose, some ways that you could think about advancing the basic block form that we've developed. It's about how you describe and build perspective onto that box. More than anything, think about the cartilage that I'm adding or subtracted from it. So in terms of the nose, I've always found it the most useful to think about the nose in profile. And I learned this from working with a lot of sculptors or teaching to sculptors. And what they would always do is when they were sculpting, they would go to the side of the model and make a sketch of the profile of the nose. And I always thought that was so interesting because it never occurred to me that you would only need that design or measurement. But what they were looking for is the nasal spine, right? Which is kind of the design or the interior design that holds all of the cartilage together. So you can feel that in your own nose if you just lightly touch the tip of your nose, and you'll feel that there's kind of two forms on either side and then a little divot in the middle. That divot in the middle would be the nasal spine or kind of septum area. And then we get that cartilage to attach. Maybe the best way to think about getting a likeness on the nose is go to the profile and then look at what kind of shape is there. Is it boxy? Is it kind of curved? Is it kind of irregular, maybe broken? Something like that. And then I'll take that in terms of a practical design and apply it to my 3D box. Right, so just a note on the practical use. If I already have this down in my drawing for the box, looked at the keystone, right? So remember how we got this? We found the keystone here, and then I took these 2 points and dropped them to where the tip of the nose was, and then we had our base of the nose as a consequence of doing the proportion, and we just dropped those back. So the way that I might implement this, right, without any extra knowledge of anatomy or cartilage, is I could use this as a center line and just take whatever was profile and interpret it here as something that's now 3D. So maybe it's like this has a bit of a wave and then it pulls back. Right? And then I would use this to start to plane off the nose itself. So maybe the nose kind of, in terms of the perspective, maybe it's flat here. This is more the presence of that nasal saddle. Right? So that gets sharper. And then maybe there's a little plane change down, right, that follows that curve. And maybe in this part, it's even a little pinched. So I'm just squeezing in that top plane of the nose. But the point is, I don't want to waste all the hard effort of having made the box and placed it and constructed it. So the idea of adding the design of the profile is really about trying to just take what you already did, all the hard work, the achievement of getting the nose to that point, and just nudging it to be a little bit more like what you see. Maybe here at the end, just as an example of how the form and the perspective buildup might aid you enough, maybe you build this out. Now, this is the ball of the nose. Maybe that's a little rounder. Right, so I'm thinking of adding maybe I wrapped some perspective clay across that and just softened out that ball of the nose. So if anything, or if nothing else, just keep that in mind, that a really good way to start to solve for your nose is look at that side view, find the design, and then translate that to your box and the way it's developed. Sometimes, though, it's useful to know a little bit more or have a bit more fun in terms of thinking about the nose and what it's made of. So maybe we can make some additions here. The nose is made of I focus on 3. That's kind of my thing. I like 3. It's about as high as I can count. It's all the math I know. So this is the basic pattern, right? I always think of everything as 3 muscles per part. This would be the same for the nose. The nose is going to have 3 basic shapes that I look for. There's alar, greater alar cartilage, and then structural fat. So these will be represented by shapes. And the benefit of shapes or representing these by shapes is, like in the eye, I can squash and stretch them, show them, underplay them, make them more or less evident. So I think of them as basic. Let's say first as a triangle. So I'll have one attachment area of cartilage to the nose, and then I'll kind of sweep that around and back. So mostly just gestural shapes for thinking the nose in this context. And then I like to get this to come down and attach or fit into the ball of the nose. We could do different colors for this area, make this nose look really weird. Here would be the rounder section. I think of this shape as maybe more of a word bubble. So we could do let's make our little designs over here. Something like this, my thought bubble, and then a bell. So that's how I start to build up the nose. If I'm going to go a step further, in other words, with the nose visualized like that, then I like to come in and think about how I would wrap these specific pieces onto that. So here would be our cartilage. Let's just give them a firmer set. You could think about how they would grow or change. The word bubble here would be what allows that cartilage to kind of build that underplane for the nose and into that middle area of cartilage that separates the nostrils. And then in the back portion, the bell would be fat. And fat is what holds the nose against the back of the surface of the face here. So we'll try to interpret this from some different views, but this at least gets you going with some simple ideas for how I'd start to think about all of this working together. So it's our 1, 2, 3, and then a preliminary idea about how to just sculpt it out if you find this to be a little too much too soon for the discussion of the nose. But we'll come back to this after we find some of these shapes on our front view again. So what are some things that might be useful here if you're trying to dig in and really make sense of the face like we did around the eye? Well, I'd first want to think more about the nasal saddle. So we could come in and if I was really starting to focus more on his likeness, maybe I'd start moving some of my vertices, some of my lines. Like he probably needs to have his keystone dropped a little bit. And we talked about how pliable these can be. Like you're designing a character, you're moving these around. Maybe this gets a little higher here, and then that would lead into the nasal saddle. Aptly named, because it looks like a tiny saddle here. And then that would broaden and open into the nasal aperture. So I'm kind of just revealing behind the box of the nose what my perspective was summarizing. And how would you find that here? Sometimes I'll look for like a hard surface. Sometimes I look for where a highlight's really prominent, something that maybe feels a little bit more planar. And then from there, kind of think more about the areas of cartilage as the softer surrounding areas. And then remember, this would be our centerpiece to that bone. So not necessary, but this just kind of helps us get a sense for what we would be surrounding and covering. If we start to work on, let's say, the side, let's develop this side. We could consider the big triangle shape, the cartilage here, coming down and kind of connecting back to the face. So what I'm trying to do with this piece, I know it's probably not entirely clear, so let's make it so, is that I'm now folding this across the box. So that triangle comes across and then down. So I'm asking for you to kind of consider two things at once, that the box is a representation of that aperture or that opening, just so you could think about the ways that the cartilage would naturally start to fill it up, and then using the box as a way to help position and fold the shapes of cartilage around it. Right? But the box would be kind of the finished look of this area in space and form. So that could be our first piece. And I always like to try to create a wedge or puzzle this into the lower area of cartilage. And then on this side, here's our cartilage. This would be our thought bubble or our speech bubble. This would determine or help me determine the width or size of the ball of the nose. So maybe in this one, what I'm thinking about is I understand that I have my box in there, and so that you could still see my line for that ending plane. If you're confused on that area too, you could look for highlights. Like I see a little highlight there. That would be representative of that corner with the kind of the cartilage or the ball put on top. And then this is going to start to tug back. So that would be that thought bubble ending. But I would use this to design what the width of the nose might be. And then we could pull that across the corner. This becomes our attachment point. I could see that flipping up underneath there. And then the last one might be the structural fat. So the attachment to the nose, or the nose to the face. And that I always like to look at as a little bell. And then I take this little bell and always flip it back and up. So half cartilage, half kind of perspective-based design, so you could start to think about how you might stack these over what exists in your face. So we want to try to do this now from a couple views so you can start to get a little bit more comfortable with what we're putting together. But I want to add one more thing too, so that as we do it, we can combine the nose with the cheek as well. So here would be just the 3 basic shapes. Remember we did triangle, speech bubble, and then bell, wrapped around the perspective of that front view of the nose. But I still have all of this empty, right? So what's important, I think, for the nose too is to think about how the rest of the cheek is playing into it, right? Because otherwise it kind of feels like I have an eye, I have a nose, and then I just have all of this area empty. So this would be the malar fat that we've been discussing periodically throughout the discussion of the face. And we've talked about it again in 2 ways. Maybe it would be useful just to show some quick differences here. So we looked at this as one example of the malar fat dropping, but the other examples would just be in terms of aging. You know, think of malar fat as all of this, right? A nice covering or coverage of anything to do with the cheekbone. That's why we get this nice soft feel across the upper portion of the cheek and face, and then almost a imperceptible curved plane that leads into the nose and socket, and why on this one it's readily visible. Right? I could see the glasses, the temple, I could see the cashew, and that malar kind of dropped more into that specific zone right up against the mouth. So this would be the benefit of having worked on it. The 2 designs you could think of for this would be in terms of the placement, high and low. So let's just do our extremes. If this was a baby, maybe we would see this fat like all the way up here, or fuller and higher. So if we think about shape and just its placement, like you take a piece of clay and you've just smoothed it up the face. And so then all of that becomes hidden. And then in the connection to the nose, this is where we'd start to get some of these more subtle planes. This is actually, I think this is the hardest part of the face, is really the way that the cheek just kind of has this soft intersection into the complex surface of the nose. And then the nose too. The nose is always pretty challenging. So that gives you an idea, right, how this would cover all of that interesting dynamic of the cheekbone under, and then start to move up and into the side plane of the nose. That would be, again, someone with more youthful face. The aged face would see that sliding down. So here's your line. Corner of the mouth, front of the cheekbone is your smile muscle. And then that malar fat in this position might be lower. So this would be the kind of the squashed version, let's say. But it still helps us understand the planar composition around the nose. So now this, think about how useful this would be too in terms of expressions. Like what happens when you smile? Well, when we smile, this little piece, the node at the corner of your mouth, gets pulled up this path to the corner of the cheek. As a result, all of your fat is pushed up and moved with it along that same path. Right? So then you have your mouth moving in that direction. Your cheek starts to pinch and create shapes like that. Maybe that moves the fat up here, and then your eye starts to squint because that fat's gotten closer. So expressions is just, you're just flexing your face fat at people. That's nothing more. Or people might think you're happy, but you're just pushing your fat around. So that would be one of the benefits for thinking of the face this way. And then we could also think of, well, how is that as a perspective starting to move me into the nose? What if I don't really understand the way these planes start to interrelate around the nose and face? So I'll start to think of this box just moving up against the nose. Also notice here, this malar fat gives you this important area of nasal labial furrow, which comes off the top of your nostril. And that would be another little box that you could sometimes see as more or less severe on people. The nice little plane change there. But also, last thing to consider, even though we're not there, what is this drawn around? This is just circling the denture sphere. All right, so my fat in this example is really just moving with that rounded surface of the egg of the mouth. So it's important that I keep that in mind so that none of these, these parts or these pockets become too autonomous, start to break off and kind of flatten out in terms of their perspectives. Let's go back to this one here. So we have this underplane that we've been already building out in terms of the nose. like that idea of kind of breaking the nose into parts and thinking about those parts as they build up over that basic box plane. That's what we'll do here. So that's my nasal saddle. If you want, we could take what is the design of the nose. If that's an instructive profile shape, I could use that as a type of guide. Maybe his nose comes out pretty consistently curved. And I do see that it gets rounder here. Might be a key notation just to help me know when to soften that plane change of the tip of the nose. I could see the rounder portion and then how it comes back and touches the face. Next part, maybe we'll create a little bit more of a softening. So maybe I'll think about, just to get some curve on these planes, this transitioning over. So building more of that curve of the cartilage across. And wrap the same thing here. This pulls back. Just like I'm coating the box with a slightly softer material, rounding it out. And at the same time, I'm looking at maybe the difference in the plane change. That looks a little broader. This looks like maybe it narrows a little bit more. In terms of the bone and thinking of the housing around the nasal saddle and skull, maybe this is sharper. And then maybe this starts to feel like it has a bit more of a curve to it. And then at the end, it looks very pointed to me. So maybe I'd think of a tighter sphere. And then I would want to do the same thing on this side too. Like, what is that curve mirrored over? I do like to get kind of this wedge of the arrow pointing into the next area of the cartilage. Again, I don't think you need to know that there's cartilage or different types. As I was saying when we started out in this lesson, you could really just think of adding a disc or half cylinder on top of the edge of the box, or a slightly altered ball or sphere or something like that. But let's take and pull this back. Give that a bit more of a rounder drop. So that would be, this is our speech bubble. How does that take and turn? So now that I'm at the underplane, I want to think about all of my information for the noses existing under there. So I'm no longer going to be consumed with kind of building up the top or the side. The last thing we would do here is just add this little pocket of fat. So let's do that here. This is going to be hard to see. You never really have a big plane break. At most, it's like a little gentle wobble from that piece to this fat in the back. Then get your thinking of for the bell. And how would that impact light and shadow? Well, bell might come out like this, down. And then as soon as I hit that plane change, now everything goes this way. So the last part of this from any perspective view would be just trying to understand or reconcile that all of these are with depth too. So maybe the bell has a bottom plane, has a thickness. And then I could see that, the nostril kind of flips back up and in. So there's maybe a little twist there to that plane, just so they don't feel too outlined. And then same thing for the center part. This comes back. So I'm going to divide a little box out of that bottom plane. So let's make this a box. It attaches here. And we could relate it back up to the tip of the nose. And then let's pull it back up and under. So we're just designing inside this plane by pushing up, taking away space for that area of the nostril, building this back out and down. I used to see students pierce this a lot. Doesn't seem to be the case as much anymore, but. And then let's take a look at the fat. So how would I start to work out from this area? Well, let's take a piece of clay and start to think of how we'd smooth it across. Maybe it comes this way, maybe it's higher. It's hard to say. Maybe this guy is a little bit more aged. Maybe we want to age him on purpose because we want a character that looks a little older. Well, I have a pretty good idea how to do that now. I could push out that bone. Maybe I start to push the fat down. Right? What if I started to push some of this down and age his face? Right? That'd be a result of that orbital septum weakening, some of the fat starting to herniate and drop. I'm not saying that this is how I see this person or this face, but it's now an option based on what you know. And then don't take this too far past. Another way to think about where that would end is look at this nice notation I have from Andrew Loomis about the rhythm of the ear to the chin. It's another good place to take it. As soon as it comes out, from here it kind of folds and then turns. And so that would line up with that rhythm of the smile. Here's that furrow that comes off the height of the nostril. Think about this as a plane that's stacked up on the face, and then you're on to the mouth after that. So a big takeaway is that all of the features are comprised of smaller perspectives that can be built up on the face in the exact same way that you built the face itself, or the understructure. That there's more to them and that they're a little bit more complex is just the nature of the features. It's nothing you can get mad at me for. So on this one, let's go more directly to just the setup and the drawing. We don't have to do as much of a build-up of the shapes. Maybe I use a center line. That helps me see that there's more of a curve down there. So let's just attack in this one. Let's say you've studied maybe the lines, the areas of cartilage, and you're good, you know what's there. Another approach to the nose is just moving these lines as they are. So instead of having this as a box, in other words, go back to that first idea. Now, it's not a box, it's a little bit peaked there. Well, I know now that could be the presence of the nasal saddle. And then this tapers. Oh, that's the way that cartilage comes in. And then, oh yeah, well, there's this larger, softer, or rounder speech bubble down here. So now instead of doing all the little pieces and building them up, I'm just going off my box and adjusting it based on having an awareness of what might be making those changes. And then, oh, I'm just going to bring this, that's about where that last piece of cartilage would start to turn. And then I get this turning back. I get a little bit of a presence of the nostril there. So instead of having this drop back so severe or be so severe, maybe I make it an S curve, right? So an S curve gives me a little bit of the way that nostril might turn and show me that there's that underplane, right? Where I think we're still above in this, but we can get a little hint of that nostril back there. And then this becomes a plane change. That's the under to the outside. Here's the back of that bell. You can even see it feels present, like the bell is here and then starts to turn down. And then this would be the thought bubble, or you could draw it as one shape. And then if I start to look up here, I could see, well, I see that there's kind of a piece of fat that starts to lead this way, and that's creating this little halftone shape that comes off the height of the back of the nose there. So this would be just as, I think, effective. It's just kind of the level that you want to start to study it at. So I think it's best always that you begin with that basic box or structure that we developed, and then start to add slowly the small forms that you would see that break the initial contour pattern that you might find from the side view. Outside of that, have fun, design your own approach if you like. I've given you a few here, whether it's the box or kind of working directly with the areas of cartilage to start designing your noses with a little bit more likeness.